Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Second Nature, a show all about living with ecological grief and loss. I am so excited about our guest today. We are in for a treat. It's one of my favorite thinkers in this space, someone I've learned so much from, and someone who's made tremendous contributions to how we think about human relationships with nature and with the environment and with all the other beings that we share this beautiful earth with. So I am so pleased to welcome Anishinaabe scholar, mother, daughter, partner, thinker extraordinaire, environmental advocate, Dr. Deborah McGregor. Deborah is internationally renowned and celebrated for her work. She's a current Canada Research Chair in Indigenous environmental justice and has done tremendous work in this space, particularly around integrating Indigenous knowledge systems within environmental governance and water justice, sustainable development, legal spheres and legal traditions, and then essential work on Indigenous theories and methods and how we understand the world and research and the stories that we tell through different lenses. She also does some really incredible work on climate justice, ecological grief, and intangible loss and damage, really bringing critical lenses and important understandings to this sphere. For me personally, Deborah has been just such a tremendous inspiration, really influential to how I look at this work, how I think about it, and has always challenged me to approach it from different lenses and to really not only look at it academically, but approach it personally and really live and embody the lessons and the learnings from this last 15 years of research and work along the journey. And soon, coming July, Dr. McGregor is going to be a Canada Excellence Research Chair in Indigenous Ways of Climate and Water for Planetary Health and Wellbeing at the University of Calgary. This is such a prestigious recognition of her incredible work, and I'm so excited to see what she's going to do in this new position. Welcome, Deborah. Welcome to Second Nature, and I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here to just, I guess, have a discussion, a chat with someone who's like-minded. Doesn't always happen. Usually we're in spaces where you're in a continuous mode of advocacy, trying to raise awareness. So it's nice just to kind of delve into the topic and get right into it.
Yeah, absolutely. It is interesting when you're in these spaces all the time trying to justify or advocate or explain, and then how much effort that takes and how much energy it takes. And then when you switch over to be able to just talk about it and talk about your human experiences and what it feels like and what you're thinking about and what you're researching. So yeah, why don't we jump right in and why don't we talk about how you moved into this space around climate justice and environmental justice and ecological grief and loss, both personally and from an academic and professional sphere.
I think for me, it was probably probably like most people, you're experiencing the world, but you didn't necessarily have the terminology or the words to describe the phenomena that you're experiencing. So in my career, or what actually my life, and then I guess it evolved into career, is just the way that I was brought up, and where I lived in a First Nation. So I'm Anishinaabe from Robinson Huron Treaty area around the Great Lakes. And so I grew up being able to drink the water. Basically, we were really, I guess, poor from a, GP, from a gross national product point of view, but you were able to basically live like from the land around you, being able to hunt, to be able to trap. Now that I kind of know more about food security, food sovereignty, that was way better protein that we were getting and way better food, and to not being able to do that. And I became very interested later on in terms of what was the knowledge and the laws around being able to live a certain way. Because over time, I could see that that loss, or I guess maybe a better word, some people prefer the word disruption, in terms of how that knowledge is passed on. It doesn't mean you have to live exactly the same way, but what is the knowledge underlying all of this? And when I became interested, so it's just how you're living. You don't think about it as, oh, we're in Sugarbush doing traditional knowledge. Like, nobody is saying that. It would have been horrifying for relatives to even hear anybody describe what they were doing in that way. Um, until this field of, traditional knowledge, Indigenous knowledge, started to emerge. And there was a lot of interest in the sustainable way of life that people became very interested. By people, I mean like the international community. So probably one of the touchstone points was the Brundtland Report in 1987
Mm-hmm.
that started to talk about, hey, these Indigenous people around the world might have something to say about how to live sustainably with the earth, the struggle, that global leaders were having in terms of starting to recognize the ecological and climate crisis that was coming. The other part of that was the start of a paradigm shift, as opposed to Indigenous peoples are just so marginalized, just so vulnerable, and just so poor. They're a problem to be solved. To switching it
Yeah.
to, hey, maybe there's something we can learn from Indigenous peoples about how to live a different way in the world, because they're doing that. It's more sustainable there. People are speaking languages. It's like what we're trying to achieve actually kind of already exists. And
Yeah.
so this whole field emerges, and you have the Earth Summit, and by then I was in graduate school, and I went, oh, that's just describing what people kind of already do, and then it becomes this
Mm.
kind of this field of study that I become very interested in. So it's also like deeply personal, but it's also becomes this academic field where you're trying to influence policy and legal frameworks, and just how people live in the world. Um, so that was sort of how I became interested in that. And that sort of serves as kind of the foundation for how I kind of approach everything now. That lens, I guess you could say. So when I started to do work in Indigenous environmental justice, like, to tell you the truth, I really didn't know what that was in terms of the field of study. But it was
Mm.
generally what I've been doing, even in my work directly with First Nations. The work around water, the work around forestry was all about Indigenous environmental. Is more like injustice is mostly what Indigenous peoples tend to be experiencing at the moment, which is you're bearing the burden of progress, for lack of a better word, and
Mm.
development. Other people are benefiting, but you're bearing the burden of other people benefiting from basically exploiting the earth. And then, so that's what Indigenous environmental justice is. And what I was bringing to that conversation was, again, because I'm looking at it from an Indigenous knowledge point of view, the foundations from what I've learned from knowledge holders and elders over decades, actually. So what I'll say here is it's not like my knowledge. I can't claim that. It's sort of what's been shared with me, and part of my job, I guess, as an educator is to then share it with others. So it's just what I've learned from them. So there might be some things I'm kind of getting wrong, because over time you sort of go, oh, that's what they meant by that. You get a deeper and more rich,
Yeah.
kind of rich understanding.
Yeah.
I've been saying this for a decade now. I kind of really understand this is actually really what it was about,
Yeah.
was that these relationships are also with what people typically call more than human or the non-human worlds, but really in Indigenous context is often referred to as kin or relatives. And the recognition that these entities and other beings in the worlds also have agency. And as humans, we don't
Mhm.
have the right to have them experience an unfair burden because of what we need as humans. So that was not a usual thing for people to be talking about in the Indigenous environmental justice space. It was mostly government. That's the only relationship that matters, because we're trying to hold them
Yeah.
accountable, or industry or the proponent. And 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 that's really important. That needs to happen, because that is clearly a big challenge. But it was also, how do
Yeah.
we start holding ourselves accountable as humans, because we're also inflicting environmental injustice upon the earth. And there's what it was doing was challenging underlying assumptions. Those assumptions are still there, I guess you could say, when I look at it in a number of fields, because I'm so
Mhm.
heavily influenced by this way of thinking and how people talked about these relationships. with the natural world or being within the natural world. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that's how I came to this. And then now I'm applying it within the climate justice, a justice realm, and mostly because I was drawn into that through First Nations asking me. I was just, I don't know anything about that topic. But once you have the framing, then that's sort of the
Yeah.
lens that you look at. You look at what's going on, and you're trying to, I guess, from an academic sense, analyze it. But your experience of it is actually often quite different, because academic tends to be very disciplined and siloed, and that's not really how people experience the world in silos and in disciplines.
Yeah, no, oh, there's so much I want to go into there, but the piece several years ago when we were at one of the gatherings we were at together, I remember you were saying something around that what we're seeing within the climate crisis is the Earth
Yeah.
communicating with us, and that all of the other relatives that we share this world with are just waiting for us to notice that they're there, and to notice that they have important things to share with us, and that they can actually tell us really essential things for us to learn from, and that they're just waiting for us to remember this responsibility and this covenant and this relationship. But so many of us, particularly non-Indigenous people around the world and in Canada, we're so separated from that. Like, we've forgotten that the earth speaks back to us. And it makes me think all the time of how, as a non-Indigenous person, when I'm working particularly up in Labrador, where I'm living now, on the homelands of the Inuit and Innu, a lot of the elders would always challenge me to say, it's great you're doing this work, but you can't think your way out of this challenge that the world is having. Like, we have to feel our way through it, and then that brings us back into this relationship. And I think that's and I struggle with that every day, because my default is to try to think, like, how can I think it? And part of it is because I don't think I always want to feel how intensely devastated or how alienated or how awful it kind of feels. And so I default to this thinking, which is very academic, very Western, trying to, like, okay, how can we step by step go through this? And if I find the right words or the right way, then people will understand. But I think what you challenge me to do, and what your writings and your work do, is to actually feel it, and to move out of the head and move into the heart, move into the spirit, and then open up to realize there's this incredibly rich fabric of relatives out there just waiting for us to kind of
Yeah.
spartan up and reach out and have that relationship. And it's such a gift that you've given me in my understanding, and also such a challenge, because it is not the natural state that so many of us are raised in. And even if you want to unlearn it, it's so embedded, like, it's so ingrained. Our school system teaches you everything the whole way through, right? And by the time you finish a PhD, it's like you're just so head centric that the heart gets lost in it. So yeah, I really love that about your work and what you're saying there. And I wonder then, like, how do we move into a different form of relationship with the natural world? And how do we have these discussions with relatives that are just waiting for us, and waiting very patiently, because many of us are very slow learners and have taken a very long time to come back to it.
I think maybe not so patiently anymore, and that's what people are calling climate disasters. I guess what people are calling climate disasters. So for me, because I always try to frame what I'm doing from, I'll just say, Indigenous knowledge perspective, but that's a whole other construct. We can spend like episodes and episodes trying to deconstruct that, and what does it actually really mean. One of the aspects of it is I go back to stories, and one of my favorite stories is the Pipe and the Eagle story, actually written in that piece. And that could also be like, it's actually a story of love and hope, but it's also a story of a climate disaster. And climate disasters happen, or in the stories, it's often described as destruction. And it's often because people are behaving very badly towards each other and to the natural world. We've forgotten those responsibilities. We've forgotten the way to be ourselves, and to be, in appropriate ethical relations intended to support life. And destruction has to come to sort it out. But in that story, the petition comes from the eagle. In Anishinaabe tradition, they're a leader, so they're petitioning on our behalf out of love for future generations. So there's always hope. And then they find people who still remember what those responsibilities are. But for us, like the climate disasters is kind of like the destruction coming because we're behaving very badly. But in the story, there's hope. We
Mm.
can still get it right. We can still there are people who kind of know how to live appropriately with the earth to stop that from happening. And also, I guess part of it is that relationship is reciprocal. So humans have this obligation. Humans ideally some love love the earth as well, and that's come out in my work. Like when I'm working in a specifically Indigenous space, that always comes up. How, like, does this show love for the earth? Is that what we're doing? But also, the earth loves us. The earth also has obligations to us, and we've disrupted that. But in right now, I guess the broader world calls that like nature-based solutions. But in the stories, like in every, like, I think there might be, but without exception, the stories that I work with, when we get ourselves in that situation as humans, usually because we are brilliant, but we can use that for good and bad. We're given the gift of will. We can use that for good and bad, and we get out of balance and we get out of control, and we're not being in a very harmonious approach to the world. Is It's always the natural world that bails us out. Always. They're always
Yeah.
bailing us out. Like our relatives, for us, it could be one of our clan members. We're all like the eagle bails us out. And the animals know what's coming in that story before humans do, because they have other senses that we don't even know what's going on in the world because we're so limited by our own, by our own senses, what
Yeah.
we consider to be our senses, which is Aristotle. And actually, we have other senses beyond what he described, the five. And
Yeah.
so the animals are always bailing us out. And the idea there is that the non-human world, these other beings, the earth, has way more knowledge than we do. They've seen, I guess, the ice age, then the melting. They've seen all of that, and we can draw on that knowledge in order to help address the challenges that we're facing. And the guiding principle around that is love and honor and respect. For us, our teachings of the seven, the original teachings, our grandfather, grandmother teachings, so those are all, like, I guess you could say, emotion or feelings. It's not, that's where it starts. And then we can employ our intellect, our will, our intelligence to help us realize what we're feeling, as opposed
Mm.
to the other way around. Like, you're thinking these things and you're forcing yourself to try to feel it. I think I see that sometimes in these circles. They're like, oh, Indigenous people talk about love. I'm going to try that. It's like, that's like, you should already have that. Like, it's the thing that comes
Yeah.
first. But you can try.
Yeah.
So this idea that there's way more knowledge out there, but it requires a degree of humility to recognize that. And again, in these other circles I find myself in, when I say that, I don't like it, because science is going to solve everything. Technology is going to solve, the thinking is going to solve everything. But it's really having that foundation of understanding that relationship, and it's a reciprocal one. And there's obligations there. And it's the natural world, I think, that's going to help us. That's going to help us if we can figure out how to reconnect and evoke those kind of feelings that are normal and human and natural, until we, as you pointed out, educate it out of people. We just totally favor the written
Hmm.
word and reading. We don't encourage people to connect, which they're able to do. Kids are able to do that until we educate them onto that. One of the things I describe to my class, because I send them outside to try to, connect, or at least describe their relationship, even if there is none. Like, what is my
Yeah.
relationship? What am I even noticing? Because we're rushing from point A to point B. Kids know how to do this, but we rush them along. Like, I see it all the time.
Yeah.
Like, hurry up. We got to get to school at 3. Quit squatting there and looking to see what those ants are doing. Don't, like, forget those bees, and don't look at those pretty flowers. Like, rush, get here, get there, get here. So there's no, we're not really encouraging that relationship and that beauty and that wonder and love for the earth. We're just trying to rush them off somewhere so they can sit inside in a row and stare at something on the, probably not even a blackboard anymore, screen
Yeah. Yeah.
in a classroom. Yeah, that was a long-winded way of responding.
No, no, it's beautiful, and it's definitely, like, I always think about, like, little Ashlee, like when I was 4 and 5. I think I was way wiser, and I was way more connected. Like, my earliest memories are of these kind of connections, and not understanding that there was a difference between me and the animals and the plants and always, out there talking and learning. And then it's like you get older and you're rushed along, or you're told, don't be silly, or that's weird, or, when you're raised in a non-Indigenous culture. And so I often try to channel the wisdom of when I was a child, when I was open and I didn't know about boundaries and I didn't know about those things. And you have that intuitive sense that I think so many of us lose as we age, particularly I think if you follow certain things like academia, which, you start to move into that space. One of the things, that I think you have done tremendously well and with others out there in the world is really showing not only the huge inequities of the climate crisis and demonstrating that Indigenous peoples are at the front lines and have been for decades, but really linking it to broader colonial structures, the enduring legacies of ongoing colonization, and then the pieces kind of related to that around what Indigenous peoples have already gone through for generations, and then how climate change becomes another layer, another injustice, and another sort of oppressive factor on people who for generations have gone through so much. So I'm wondering if we can talk about some of that work and what it means and how we can challenge to remember that it is always a colonial process at the end that has gotten us to this stage.
I always refer to it as the other C word, so it's capitalism. And because when you go into these spaces, everything's about carbon, and that's fair because that's how IPCC defines the problem around carbon. But really, we're made of carbon. We eat carbon all the time. Like it's basically what humans have developed a very unhealthy relationship to carbon, like reducing what we're facing to element in the periodic table, to me is just really bizarre when it's you've got colonialism and
Yeah,
capitalism.
we're not looking at our responsibilities or structures.
We can solve this carbon thing, and like, no, we got to solve us thing around colonialism.
Yeah, it's much easier to blame carbon than to tackle undoing the colonial legacies.
And I'll be,
So,
because carbon, I guess, is easier, even though it's harder. I think, I mean, when I start off from what I'll call the stories or the Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge perspective is, in a lot of the stories that I'm like really influenced by and that I find myself I just love the stories, I guess I'll just say, is in those stories, we get to self-determine our own solutions. Yeah, we face destruction, we face disaster, and we were given guidance and instruction, knowledge, laws about how to move out of those situations, right? And it always related back. We need to be appropriate in our relationships with Earth and each other. So we were able to, what I call, self-determine our solutions in those stories. What happens with colonialism and capitalism is we're denied that because you got these structures that prevent you from, getting to self-determine what is understood to be the solution, because it's based on a number of assumptions like human separation from the natural world. But what's happened is part of Indigenous people's interactions with Turtle Island anyway. I mean, this happened around the world. I can't speak for that with any kind of authority, is the disruption of those relations that were there for thousands of years.
yeah.
But Indigenous peoples have survived that. I mean, when you think about Canadian policy, Sir John A. Macdonald, I wasn't supposed to be here, certainly not as an Indian so I could say I'm an Anishinaabe, part of the Anishinaabe nation. That wasn't supposed to happen, but we survived that. And we're here, not only survived, but we flourished. We didn't just hunter-gatherer and survive for thousands of years. We're flourishing as societies. And so there's something to learn from Indigenous people. We've also had to face major environmental and climatic change through dispossession, through alienation from lands, through like physical removal of people from their communities to be far away. So we've already experienced what other people in society are starting to experience, and they're in a big panic mode about it. Because they're finally experiencing what Indigenous people
Experiencing it.
experience. And there's
Yeah.
something to learn from Indigenous people. What's enabled this survival, for lack of a better word, is basically our own knowledge and traditions, our connection to the land, like our being able to live out those responsibilities and relationships. A lot of that has been hugely disrupted, but is still there in many communities. So that's what's enabled other people's solutions haven't worked. That was the main finding from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples was colonial and Canadian policies to solve the Indian problem, they called it, have been failed. So other people's solutions don't work out that well for us. And it's the same thing with
Hmm.
climate solutions. So what is it about our ability to be able to survive these massive changes and still be present to talk about our knowledge and experiences? Others can learn from that as well.
Yeah, and working in Labrador, one of the early things, even back in 2008, 2009, that a lot of the elders in particular were really framing it as just another injustice that then amplifies all the other injustices. And that there was such a frustration that even if people in Nunatsiavut had ideas about how to adapt or what needed to be done or how to do policies, that the existing federal and provincial laws and policies actually prohibited or stopped or made it nearly impossible to do what people would have
Hmm.
previously done. And so a lot of the elders in particular were talking about having stories pass on that, about how you, like in times of change, what you would do. And then suddenly they couldn't because the colonial laws and the structures and the systems just stopped it. And so then what do you do? So you've got this imposed climate change, Inuit have been at the front lines for decades and decades, trying to say for decades and decades, the climate is changing. And people were saying, no, it isn't, like
Hmm.
everything's fine. And even now in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, like Labrador is the fastest warming place in the north. And yet our province as a whole has not taken a strong stance on climate change or climate adaptation, or even really recognizing how much Labrador is being impacted. And so you have people for decades saying this is another form of alienation, of dispossession. A lot of people who had been forcibly relocated in their younger years and then sort of reestablished connection to the land were saying that climate change was actually bringing those feelings back up again because you're still in place, but the land around you has changed. So it's connecting to that solastalgia concept of homesickness while still in home. And yet I'm finding globally there are so few voices having that conversation. We are stuck on the carbon. We're stuck on the solutions of, the technocratic approach. The nature-based solutions I find so entertaining and also irritating
Defeating.
because it's still a technocratic approach to nature. Like if we just engineer nature, then the nature-based solutions will follow. And we're missing this whole other area around justice and injustice and inequality and what other knowledge systems can we learn from and what other beings can we learn from? I mean, that the human conceit that continues on that we can only learn from humans and only a limited amount of humans is it makes it so hard to be able to actually move forward in a way that could make significant structural and global change on the matter.
I think there's a major gender element to it as well. I think about the work that you've done on eco grief and where I guess the aha moment happened. I mean, I might be getting it wrong. You can speak to it, but it was speaking to women. So I'm thinking,
Yes,
okay, there's a
definitely.
hugely gendered element to this because the way that climate change is being studied in the North was very much through monitoring, usually talking to men. So it's very defined
Yep.
by usually men type researchers, whatever, going up north, wanting to study, use their machines, like, their technology, go to the
Yep.
lab, like generally tending to be men because a lot of climate science researchers, it is very hugely biased in a gendered kind of
Yep.
way. So to me, gender is a huge part of that. And I think it was Rutgers, and they had they did a study, maybe it was in 2000 or 2001 of the 1,000 top climate science researchers. Um, Most of them from actually surprisingly Europe, I thought it would be United States, and very few women, maybe only about 120 something women. And they didn't talk about Indigenous or Black people, mostly from the global North. Hardly anybody from the global South. So hugely biased in terms of how we're even defining the problem, diagnosing the problem, what the solution is going to be. So when I think about the work that you did, I thought there's a huge gendered element to that for the work that has happened in the North is hugely kind of biased by the questions that someone is. So that and they were focused on monitoring, not on governance, or how do Inuit want to self-determine their own solutions? Like, that's not really the big research question that's being funded. Like, it's it's more like the techno. We want to use our fancy machines and do this and that and run some models, and which is still valuable work, but it's hugely skewed to that, and we're not getting the other stories and the other experiences and the other knowledge that could come from that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for me, the change, and I talked about this in the very first episode of the show, was with Elder Sarah Bakey. And, we were in her house, my 1-year-old was crawling around on the floor. We were having tea and we were talking. And then the question was, instead of what you're seeing, and it's interesting because when we were talking to people, everyone was so used to saying, I see this, I see this, I see this, because that's what they thought
Uh-huh.
researchers wanted to hear. And then I was like, but how do you feel? And then that change. And then suddenly all of these women started talking about it, and then also made it okay for the men to talk about it. But that sense of, why, and I asked people, I was like, why have you never shared this with previous researchers that have been around? They're like, well, no one ever asked us. Like, nobody ever asked the question. Like, nobody cared to ask, nobody thought to ask. And I thought that was so interesting in those moments, but then also in those early years of the community sharing what they were feeling, and the negative response and the backlash from predominantly white male researchers was like, no, that's not true. And I remember being at a conference where Inuit women were presenting and saying, these are our experiences. And then a very senior, prominent white male in the sphere stood up and said, I don't believe this. I don't think any of this is true. It's like, but how, like, they're telling you it's true. And then there was this huge divide in the room where the other Inuit and Indigenous peoples were like, no, this is our experience. And then all the researchers are like, no, you have to prove it. We need years of study. And I remember one of the leads on our research, Elder Charlotte Wolfrey, who was also Angie or mayor at the time, was so mad because she's like, you can't take away our feelings and our lived experience. You've stripped everything else away from us, but you cannot take away our feelings on this. And seeing that juxtaposition, that people didn't even want to hear it from someone. Like, it's not that they couldn't conceive it, they just couldn't even hear it from someone else, particularly
Mhm.
women saying, we feel this. And they're like, well, that's not science. So, and thankfully things are shifting over time, and we're seeing more and more of an understanding of the importance of these emotions in the environmental and climate crisis spheres. But, just seeing that gendered silencing of women, of emotions, of Indigenous women, and then just a complete disavowal by many people in the scientific community of like, no, I don't believe it. I'd say, well, okay, but other people are experiencing it. So it's so fascinating to think about where those stories have come from, and then what systems try to shut them down. And I think your work does so much on that too, is opening up, trying to challenge systems with other stories that show us other possible futures. And I have always loved that about your work, because the stories that you share demonstrate many possible futures that don't mean we have to follow the technocratic colonial globalization process that we're in, that there is hope, and that maybe the other creatures in this world haven't given up on us fully. Because I worry about that. Like, I worry, have they given up? And I wouldn't blame them if they have, because certainly many humans, not all humans, have behaved quite badly and quite horribly for a very long time.
Well, fortunately, they still tend to love us. So, so love is a feeling. Same with hope. Like, those are things that I guess people try to measure, but probably haven't really related it until recently to, and actually along to climate anxiety type of how people are taking it up. But those are also feelings. And to me, what I found when I first entered the space was people, you found in your own experiences, people didn't ask the right questions. And so so all the kind of questions that were being asked, usually by Southern, by the time I was experiencing it, well, white men, were, they had a particular narrative about what was going on, and they didn't really want to hear kind of other, I guess, other kind of perspectives. I remember one of the first meetings I ever went to, someone just whirled around in their chair and said, I don't understand what colonialism has to do with any of this. And I went, oh, like,
Uh-oh.
do you even live in Canada? Like TRC had come
Yep.
out by then. And, so like, how did you, like, are you living under a rock? How do you not even know that this is like a thing?
Yeah.
So when you don't ask the right questions, the body of work that we rely on for the solutions is very narrow and very limited. And so you need different people in the space to ask those different kind of questions, or better yet, Indigenous folks to be asked the kind of questions that are important to them. And a lot of that has to do with the reconnection. A lot of it has to do with the feelings, things that are very hard to manage and techno fix. The techno fix is so incredibly dominant. It's really hard to crack
So
that
much.
code. But I think as youth and women and people who tend to be excluded from that space, as they continue their advocacy and work, they're starting to challenge that and bring other kind of narratives and stories into that space, because clearly is what I call the disaster reports that come out, the IPCC reports, World Water Report in a few weeks, um, the IPBS, the nature assessment reports, they're getting worse and
Yeah.
worse over time. So the technocratic kind of approach to things clearly is not working. It is not working. So you would think the writing would be kind of more on the wall to that clearly other kind of approaches and thinking and ways of being are required.
And I'm endlessly fascinated by the hold that the technocratic solutions has in the sphere. And I think a lot of it is I do think underneath people are panicking, they're desperate and they don't know what to do, but they're turning to places that somehow seem easier. Because if you look at the technocratic solutions, it's a like this, then this, then this, and everything will be okay. And you don't have to grapple with, oppression and colonization and injustice and death and suffering and loss and damage and all of the emotions. You don't have to grapple with losses beyond comprehension. You can think, oh, well, I'll just put my faith in someone and a solution and it'll be okay. And it removes the personal responsibility that we have. And I'm wondering, as we're kind of coming near to the end, one of the things that you talk about in your work and your stories and your sharing is the Anishinaabe concept of living the good life. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind sharing with all the listeners kind of what this concept means and how you have come to it around the work that you're doing in all aspects of environmental justice. And then the very generous gifts that you grant the rest of us who are learning from you continually.
I think the Minna I think, which means, good life or living well, it's not, and it doesn't just mean humans. It's not possible to achieve this, and it's our goal, unless our relatives and other entities are well. Like, so part of it, embedded within it is that kind of reciprocal relationship. So that's our ultimate goal and obligation and what the outcome, I guess, of Minna is sustaining life. The support your goal is to support life. So the concept to me is sort of the opposite of destruction, sort of the path that we're heading in by scientific accounts, and then the path that we're heading in, from, let's say, Indigenous accounts, where I would suspect most people do have what would be the disaster destruction stories and have instructions for how to get out of this particular situation. And usually those point to the idea of well-being with the earth. And I actually think most Indigenous people have that concept. They have this concept of well-being, but it extends out to, I guess, what I would call the natural world or creation or other relatives. And this is huge. It isn't even just what's on the planet. Like, ours is also the moon and also the sun and also the stars. Those are part
Mhm.
of that whole world and set of responsibilities, and those reciprocal set of responsibilities. So in order to live the good life, it is being responsible to the natural world, but also your ancestors. How do I honor my ancestors?
Mhm.
What kind of ancestor am I going to be? How am I taking care of descendants? Am I going to be a good ancestor? How am I taking care of future generations? So it's a huge concept, and in my kind of experience, it almost comes up every time in any kind of Anishinaabe
Mhm.
kind of gathering. People will talk about it, about how our obligation is to try to achieve this well-being with that happens with the earth itself. I don't find that's generally the outcome. What I would see in a lot of the assessment reports, it's mostly damage control, that kind of
Yeah.
like, yeah. So a lot of it is um, damage control or harm reduction. That tends to be the approach to it, as opposed to how can you actually envision a different way of being in the world? And that's what Nunavut does. Like it's a different way of being in the world. They don't really offer that for people. Like they don't offer that up. Let's just have this techno solution. This is how much it's going to cost. Now we need to do climate repair and do weird things there. It's not really offering up a transformation for people at all, which is even what all the disaster reports are calling for. So as you pointed out,
Yeah.
people don't want to. I guess it goes back to the idea of sustainable development and sustainability, which is how do we keep taking from the earth in a sustainable way so we can sustain this unsustainable way, unsustainable way of living. That's essentially what it means. But a transformation is completely the opposite. And what you learn from this idea or this goal that we have for living well-being with the earth is you have a completely different way of being. And I don't know if I describe it as a law or as an ethic, and that's the concept of there is a concept in Anishinaabe language, but I don't know it.
Mm.
My father talked about it. He passed away before I could interrogate him about it, but he didn't really like answering those kind of direct questions. He preferred that you sort of learn things kind of on your own through
Mm.
experience. And that was the idea of we're always giving back to the earth, that we're not taking. So every day in Anishinaabe, get up and you think about what is my gift to the earth going to be, as opposed to what can I
Mm.
take? Am I going to get the Starbucks? Am I going to get here? What am I like? Most people get up and think about all the things they're going to be taking from the earth, as opposed to getting up and thinking about what is my gift going to be to the earth. The other part of it is how do we receive those gifts in a good way that the earth is offering us, as opposed to taking. Like that kind of shifts. And there's a whole story that I talk about in our sugar bush, which is kind of coming at a weird time because the weather's been so weird. Like usually it's like mid-March to kind of into April, but it's probably
Yeah.
going to be earlier this year. But my brothers wanted to, so we do it more, I guess for lack of a better word, traditional. And the way that so the iron pot, we have the fire, tap trees, decide which ones are going to be tapped whichever year. And my brothers wanted to just make it a little easier because now you're dealing with the wage economy, like who can get time off work because you got to be in there all the time in the bush. So they wanted to do weirdly, people call it the pipeline system, like which do we doing in Southern Ontario and the conservation authorities. These hoses that are attached to the trees and they go into this big building and all the syrup goes in and then they evaporate it and whatever. And my father said no. So we could do this. We could do
Mm.
this as Anishinaabe. We could do this we could afford to do it. My mother's a teacher. Everyone's well educated. Everyone has a job. We could afford to do that. My dad said no, because what it does is it
Mm.
shifts your, I guess, thinking, your ontology in terms of your relationship to the trees and to the bush and to the work, as we no longer receive that gift from those trees. We know each tree individually. Like he goes and visits each one and would just taught my brothers this, which ones are going to be tapped that year. We go from receiving that gift from the trees to taking from them. And he goes, we're not doing that. So I think about like those common, I guess, stereotypes of Indigenous people. They just didn't have they weren't smart enough or technological enough to destroy the earth. I'm like, yeah, we could, but we
Yeah.
didn't because we
Yeah.
had our own
Yeah. It
laws
was a
because there's
choice.
these ethics around.
Yeah.
So that's how we still do it. So I describe it as a way of being in the world. And it's what you probably find in your work, even with eco grief, and people want the checklist. These are the things I need to do to get out of the situation. I go, it's not like that.
Yeah.
There isn't a little checklist at the back of a workbook that tells you how to be in the world. It's like literally how you experience the world, what you understand to be alive, I guess your ontology of the world, that we're going to receive a gift rather than take, that we're going to get up every day and think about what our gift is going to be as opposed to what we're going to take. That's the way of being in the world. And I
Mm.
think that in many ways is under assault, but it's still there. Like it is still there in communities, and to me, that's where the love and the hope comes from, because there's a recognition that, like for us, the sugar bush, that sap comes at a time of major food insecurity. It's hard to hunt and it's hard to fish, so we need that nourishment. That is the gift from those trees. It just wouldn't occur to people to dishonor that. Well, I guess it occurred to make it easier to fit it into the work schedule people had, but it was like,
Mm.
no. We're receiving a gift. It is not taking. So yeah, I'll end there by just saying it's a way of being in the world, and there's no nice little checklist for this. It's sort of requires a transformation and imagination. What is it like to be in the world that way? People can't even imagine it. I think is a major lack of imagination. I think, yeah.
No, thank you, Deborah. I think that's the most beautiful way to end the conversation around what will we give and what will we do today as people are listening to this and as we move forward, what do we owe the earth rather than trying to take it, and how, if we're feeling these emotions of grief and loss and anger and frustration, how instead of just feeling them, we can actually use them to reconnect and remind ourselves that we have responsibilities and obligations and ethics to create and enhance and develop relationships, and to learn other ways of being in the world so that we can actually transform ourselves, not just look for these
Mhm.
external solutions that we hope will save us. So thank you so much. I mean, as usual, you give so many gifts when you talk, and it's just your generosity of brilliance and spirit and learning and sharing is so moving. And it's been such an honor to have you here today joining us on Second Nature.
Thank you for having me and having a conversation that I like to have.
Yeah, no, I love these two, and one of the ways that I've taken to signing off is by sharing one of my favorite Francis Weller quotes, who wrote "The Wild Edge of Sorrow," and he says it takes outrageous courage to face outrageous loss. So courage, my friends, and until next time, take good care. This was Second Nature, Living with Ecological Grief. Thank you for joining us today for another powerful conversation about environmental love and loss. And of course, the conversation continues, so please make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and visit ashleeconsolo.ca for more information. Until next time, thanks for tuning in, and take good care.